Greetings, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to come and see me and hear my presentation on the ERA. There is no proper tense. Let me start off with you that it has been stated or heard for some reason that it's the children's fault and how they're saying the N-word with the A at the end. And although there has to be accountability for the actions and the statements and the words that anyone says, regardless of whom they are and how old they may be, at the end of the day, this word has been in place for over 4 centuries. And so therefore I say as an advocate that it is not the fault of our children/students. The responsibility lies solely on our shoulders. Now, let me go ahead and move right into this topic. And I'm going to start with the greology. A group of folks set out to explore, expand, and conquer regions that was rich in natural resources and minerals such as gold, rice, sugar, tobacco, rubber, diamonds, cotton, cocoa, and salt, just to name a few. And it had land, vast amounts of it. However, this land was occupied by numerous indigenous communities that had occupied these regions for thousands of years. Conflict. You see, this group of folks had, let's say, unkind intentions, like to steal not only the natural resources, minerals, and land, but also enslave and subjugate the indigenous peoples who occupied these lands in perpetuity. Then keep all the riches for their self-fulfillment, hide, suppress, and rewrite history, and create contracts, policies, and systems that would justify, support, and ensure their domination and reign in supremacy. All of this while having no regard to the catastrophic impact it would have on the indigenous people's way of life. Now, to operationalize their vision, decrees were put into motion. First, there was the Papabulls Diversas of 1452, 1453, and 1455, issued by Pope Nicholas V, that granted the right to reduce Africans to hereditary slavery. Now, so that you know, this was not a one-time thing. Pope Calixtus reiterated it in 1456. Pope Sixtus and Pope Leo renewed it in 1481 and 1514. And it was also extended to the New World in 1493. Conspiracy or coincidence that Christopher Columbus was stated that he founded the Americas in 1492. But anyway, that's a whole new story. Then there was the Asiento de Negros in 1517. This was an agreement between the Spanish crown and another sovereign power to supply Africans to the Spanish colonies in the New World. Henceforth, the etymology of the N-word was planted. And by the way, did you know that Africans ruled Spain from 711 to the 1400s? Is that a coincidence, or is that conspiracy that all this is occurring? Now, let's fast forward to 1619 in the New World. So now, in 1619, and I want to share with everyone, we are going into now what we call the etymology of the N-word. In 1619, the N-word gave birth, and its purpose was to intentionally degrade, dehumanize, and make recognizable a group of people, Africans, if you will, whom were captured and taken from their families and homes and homeland for the exploitation and creation of a social category of forced free laborers in perpetuity. In other words, the N-word was now a descriptor that codified Africans into three classifications in one grouping: labor, which was involuntary servitude, and property. Socioeconomic status was poverty, and race, black. Now, it is here you begin to see how the systems operated in a group of folks take shape in order to operationalize their vision. Because in 1661, slavery was legalized in Virginia. And in 1750, those who were enslaved were made inferior by law. So what do you think happened next? Exactly. The sale of kidnapped Africans boomed internationally, and they were a high commodity stock. In fact, in 1760, an estimate of 760,179 kidnapped Africans were imported to the Americas, and not only for the forced free labor in the fields as it has been shown in TV. Nah, there was a darker, sinister side of this whole peculiar institution, if you will. It was the most profitable that was never spoke about, and that was slave breeding. Case in point, Thomas Jefferson passes a law in 1807 that ended the international slave trade. By the way, off the cuff, let me quickly acknowledge Sally Hemings. Okay, continuing. Guess what happens when he passes this law? The domestic slave trade not only increased, but it produced on average 10 to 20,000 enslaved Africans per month. And this slave breeding plantation, if you will, not only raping women, but also raping girls as young as 13 years of age. Now, you remember it was the poppables by the popes keeping the hereditary label over Africans continuous. Was this intentional, or was it a coincidence? Well, moving forward. So who exactly were these kidnapped Africans that this group of people took out of Africa, separated from their families, and intentionally branded as subhuman, simian-like, uneducated, incapable of caring for themselves, and natural slaves by utilizing the politics of color, pseudoscience, and identity? Well, I'll tell you who they were. They were humans. They were not uneducated. In fact, They were quite the opposite. They were kings and queens, generals and warriors, emperors and rulers of Roman and African empires. They were artisans and inventors. They were visionaries and developers of kingdoms, dynasties, historical landmarks, colleges, and libraries. They were scholars and founders of medicine, mathematics, philosophy, and architecture, just to name a few. And in fact, they brought Europe out of, let's say, the Dark Ages 2 times. But most importantly, they were children. They were mothers and fathers, siblings and cousins, aunts and uncles, and grandparents. This group of folks went into a land intentionally and stole, separated, and sold people like animals, cattle, if you will. Then, to justify their actions, they created this story that this group of folks were not human, that they had no emotions or feelings, and needed to be saved. Then they followed it with a global propaganda campaign that reinforced this lie. You see, it has been estimated that 5.4 to 8.1 million Africans perished during this atrocious journey from their homes to 1865. And those who survived were subjugated to a minimum of 770,201 hours of the harshest, inhumane conditions imagined, that caused flesh to detach from their bones, and psychological traumas, ailments, and diseases that went untreated. Now, as I move forward a little bit, this is the portion that comes in that the descriptor begins to evolve. And when it evolves, it goes from a descriptor to something else. Now, in 1865, when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, the N-word evolved from a descriptor to a hateful, denigrative weapon, figuratively, if you will, and to some cases, literally, that was meant to terrorize, inflict harm, and instill the worst type of fear possible in Africans. Now, I say Africans because their citizenship wasn't granted until 1866, which was post-Emancipation Proclamation and the Texas Memo of 1865. So as I continue, since Africans were no longer property, an entirely new social order was created to keep the status quo through violence and intimidation, such as lynchings, home invasion, homicides and bombings, community massacres, and brutal mob attacks on men, women, and children, followed by laws that restricted access, if they had any, to education, public transportation, housing, jobs, and voting, and then reinforced it with a derogatory marketing campaign, propaganda, if you will, that would socially condition the world with negative stereotypes about who Africans were not, such as lazy, unintelligent, animalistic, and having an ascription to criminality. And still, African Americans fought, achieved, and fought once again, achieved, and fought to regain what had been lost. And while all of these pocket fire battles were going on during this transitional breezy smiles and nods time frame, this shifty organism that we know as the N-word managed to survive lurking in dark corners before it once again gradually evolved, not only to an unspeakable obscenity, but also as a cultural shift known as a subversive cadence, a term of endearment, if you will. So apparently, I guess it was thought, and I'm not sure by whom, that if we harnessed this 0.0005 kilograms of racially insensitive carbon dioxide from the past that helped shape a racial hierarchy that spanned for 4 centuries since its conception of anti-black attitudes, value, and behavior that captured a personal antipathy and institutionalized racism towards African Americans, and make it a term of endearment by simply replacing the ER with an A, subjectively speaking, there is nothing endearing about 8 million lives murdered and 12.5 million lives subjected to over 770,000 hours of forced free labor, medical experimentation with no pain medication, rapings, malnourishment, torture, food deprived, and so much more for 246 years. Absolutely not. This word was not created as a term of endearment. It was brought into this world as pure evil, and it should no longer exist. It is an abominable malice towards a people. It continues to divide nations and communities, and it has the power to destroy careers and reputations. And I believe it's time to allow our ancestors to rest. Therefore, whether you say ER or A, regardless of what complexion your skin is, there is no proper tense. I thank everyone for your time. And it is at this point that I ask you all, this is a shared effort. And no one, in my opinion, has the right to tell anyone what they should and should not say and what they can and they cannot say. However, we can ask. I am asking those who have platforms, whether it be social media, athletics, musicians, lawyers, doctors, educators, superintendents, council folks, mayors, governors, representatives, congresspeople. I'm even asking the President of the United States to walk in this journey shoulder to shoulder so that we may eradicate and interrupt this word.